It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Victoria Vance laughed as she poured the vintage champagne over Elena Vance's sleeve in front of the entire gala committee. The pale gold liquid cascaded down the fine, unbranded charcoal wool of Elena's blazer, pooling on the white linen tablecloth of the Metropolitan Club. The room went silent. The scent of cloying lilies and expensive, heavy perfumes seemed to freeze in the air. Mrs. Gable, sitting to Victoria's right, let out a sharp, bird-like gasp that was more excitement than shock. "Oh, Elena," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a performative sweetness that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. She didn't even bother to set the bottle down, holding it like a scepter. "I am so sorry. I suppose I'm just used to people who move with a bit more grace. But then again, that jacket looks like it came from a department store clearance rack. I'm sure it'll dry without a stain." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the chilled moisture seeping through the fabric, hitting her skin, but she kept her back straight. She didn't reach for a napkin. She didn't apologize for being in the way. She simply looked at her mother, seeing the frantic need for dominance hidden behind the designer facade. Victoria was wearing a bespoke silk suit that screamed its price tag to anyone within a mile, yet she lacked the refinement to realize Elena's, unbranded, blazer was hand-stitched merino wool that cost 3 times as much. "It's quite all right, Mother," Elena said, her voice calm and level. It was the tone she used when she was deconstructing a billion-dollar money laundering scheme at the firm. Cold, precise. Accidents happen when one's grip is failing. Julianne Vance leaned forward, her smartphone already out and angled perfectly to capture Elena's damp sleeve. The gold bangles on Julian's wrist clattered with a sharp, rhythmic tapping as she adjusted her lighting. "Don't be so sensitive, Elle," Julianne smirked, her eyes fixed on her screen as she uploaded the clip to her story. "Mom's just trying to help you realize that you can't keep showing up to these high-society luncheons looking like a charity case. It's embarrassing for the brand. My followers are already asking if you're the help." Mrs. Gable chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Appearance is everything in our circle, dear. Your mother provides so much for this city. The least you could do is reflect the Vance standard." Elena glanced around the table. At the far end, Arthur Vance sat in silence, his eyes fixed firmly on his salad. He knew the truth about where the Vance standard currently stood, but he was too weakened by years of Victoria's erosion to speak up. He was a witness who had chosen blindness. Elena felt a vibration in her pocket. It was a rhythmic, insistent pulse. She didn't need to look at the screen to know it was Marcus Thorne. The audit was complete. The legal triggers were set. The sleeping lion was no longer dreaming. "You're right, Julianne," Elena said, finally picking up her water glass. She took a slow, deliberate sip. "Appearance is everything. It's fascinating how much people will overlook as long as the surface remains polished." Victoria's eyes narrowed. She didn't like the lack of tears. She hated the lack of a scene. She lived for the frantic scrambling of a victim, and Elena was giving her nothing but a mirror. "Is that a threat, Elena?" Victoria asked, her voice dropping an octave, the social mask slipping just enough to show the predator beneath. "Because remember who pays for your lifestyle. Remember whose name is on the door of that little office you play in." "I remember exactly whose name is on everything," Elena replied. She stood up slowly, the wet wool heavy on her arm. She reached into her small, leather clutch and pulled out a single, embossed card. She didn't hand it to Victoria. She placed it on the table, right in the center of the spilled champagne. The white card began to soak up the vintage bubbly, the ink of Marcus Thorne's law firm name becoming dark and prominent. "I have a meeting," Elena said, her gaze sweeping over the committee members, who were all watching with bated breath. "I'd suggest you enjoy the rest of this bottle, Mother. It might be the last one the Vance estate can actually afford to waste." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Julian's phone hitting the table. Victoria's face didn't collapse yet. That would come later, but the color began to drain from her cheeks, leaving her blush looking like a bruise. Elena turned and walked toward the exit of the Metropolitan Club. Her heels made a steady, echoing click against the marble floors, a sound of absolute certainty. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she pulled her phone from her pocket and swiped it open. There was one message from Marcus. Everything is in place. The compliance filing hits the board's desks at 9 a.m. tomorrow. They have no idea the locks have already been changed. Elena stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the city noise rushing to meet her. She didn't feel the cold anymore. She felt the weight of 5 years of silence finally beginning to shift. She looked back at the club's imposing facade one last time. The countdown had begun. Victoria Vance had 24 hours of generational wealth left, and she was going to spend them wondering why her daughter hadn't cried. Elena signaled for a car, her eyes cold and bright. The toast had been bitter, but the meal was going to be devastating. The next morning, the scent of stargazer lilies and expensive roast coffee choked the air of the Vance breakfast room. Elena Vance sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her fingers tracing the cool, unadorned rim of her white porcelain cup. She wore a charcoal silk knit sweater, unbranded, meticulously stitched, and worth more than the designer logo Julianne Vance was currently flaunting for her phone camera. To her family, however, Elena was merely a gray smudge against their vibrant, stolen luxury. "And here is the family's resident office drone," Julianne sneered, angling her phone to catch Elena in the frame of her morning vlog. The ring light clipped to the device cast a sickly, artificial halo. "Look at that drab outfit, guys. It's giving unpaid intern vibes. Should we start a GoFundMe for her wardrobe, or is she just committed to looking like a disappointment?" Victoria Vance laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that harmonized with the clink of her silver spoon against bone china. She was draped in a cream Chanel housecoat, her pearls catching the morning light. "Don't be cruel, Julian. Elena has to be frugal. I imagine her little risk compliance salary barely covers the bus fare. It's a shame, really. With your father's nose and my grace, you could have been someone, Elena. Instead, you're just paperwork." Arthur Vance kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the financial section of the newspaper. The paper trembled slightly in his grip, a rhythmic rustle that betrayed the guilt he was too weak to voice. He knew the truth of the trust, but he had traded his spine for Victoria's approval decades ago. "Speaking of paperwork," Victoria said, her tone shifting from mocking to predatory. She set her cup down with a decisive clack that echoed off the marble floors. "The catering deposit for the Vance Heritage Gala is due by noon. Julian's guest list has expanded to include the local press, and the floral budget has doubled. I've decided you're going to transfer your quarterly bonus to the house account today. It's only fair, considering you still occupy a wing of this estate for free." The audacity was a physical weight in the room. Victoria wasn't asking. She was demanding a tribute from a daughter she treated like a servant, all to fund a party designed to stroke her own ego. Elena felt a familiar spark of heat in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She reached into the pocket of her slacks and felt the smooth, tempered glass of her phone. A haptic buzz vibrated against her palm. She didn't need to look to know it was Marcus Thorne. The filing was live. The digital locks were being turned. "The house account?" Elena asked, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "Don't take that tone," Victoria snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Gable is coming over at 10 to finalize the seating chart. I won't have you ruining the mood with your typical gloom. Just move the money. It's the least you can do to pay back the generational wealth that provides for your lifestyle." Elena stood, her chair silent against the thick Persian rug. She looked at her mother, truly looked at her, seeing the hollow vanity that held the woman together. Victoria spoke of generational wealth as if she had built it, oblivious to the fact that she was currently standing on a trapdoor Elena had spent 5 years rigging. "I'll take care of the accounts, Mother," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "But you might want to check the balance yourself before Mrs. Gable arrives. I have a feeling the numbers are going to be unexpected." "Is that a threat?" Julianne piped up, her phone still recording. "Are you going to cry because you have to pay rent?" Elena didn't answer. She turned and walked toward the hall, the sound of her heels a rhythmic, ticking countdown. She checked her watch. 8:15 a.m. In exactly 45 minutes, the compliance filing would hit the board's desks. The Vance family accounts wouldn't just be empty, they would be frozen under a legal injunction for misappropriation of trust funds. She stepped into the foyer, passing the towering portrait of her grandfather. He was the one who had whispered the truth to her on his deathbed. The secret of the sleeping lion clause he'd built into the family trust to protect it from Victoria's greed. Elena pulled her phone out and swiped. One message from Marcus was waiting. The board just received the notification. The audit starts at 9. They have no idea the floor is already gone. She looked back at the breakfast room door. She could hear Victoria laughing again, probably bragging to Julianne about how she'd finally put Elena to use. Elena walked out the front door into the crisp morning air. She had exactly 38 minutes to get to the office before the screaming started. The countdown was over. The hunt had begun. 2 days had passed since the audit notification hit the board's desks like a silent grenade. Elena Vance stood in the glass-walled lobby of Thorne and Associates, watching the morning fog cling to the skyscrapers of the financial district. The air here smelled of expensive espresso and the sharp, ozone scent of a high-end air purifier. It was a far cry from the cloying, floral potpourri Victoria insisted on keeping in every room of the family estate. She turned as Marcus Thorne stepped into the reception area. He looked every bit the high-priced fixer, his charcoal suit tailored to a razor's edge. He didn't offer a smile. They were past the point of pleasantries. He simply gestured toward his private office. Once the heavy oak door clicked shut, Marcus slid a navy blue leather folder across the mahogany desk. Elena felt the cool, pebbled grain of the leather under her fingertips, the tactile weight of a weapon finally loaded. "The sleeping lion clause is fully activated," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble of professional satisfaction. "I've spent the last 48 hours coordinating with the forensic team. Your grandfather didn't just leave you a safety net, he left you a kill switch." The moment the audit flagged the unauthorized transfers to Victoria's offshore charity accounts, the trust's ownership structure shifted. "You are no longer just a beneficiary, Elena. You are the sole conservator of the Vance estate." She opened the folder. The documents inside were crisp, the ink of the signatures dark and final. "And the accounts?" "Frozen," he replied. "I've issued the injunctions. By midnight tonight, every credit card associated with the primary household account will be declined. The luxury vehicles, the staff payroll, the maintenance for the summer house, it all requires your personal authorization now. They're living in a palace of glass, and you just took the keys to the foundation." A sharp, rhythmic chiming interrupted them. Elena glanced at her phone. Julianne Vance was calling via FaceTime. She hesitated, then swiped to accept, propping the phone against a stack of legal briefs. Julian's face filled the screen, her makeup stage-ready and her blonde hair blown out into perfect, expensive waves. She was standing in a brightly lit boutique, rows of designer handbags gleaming behind her like trophies. "Elena, finally," Julianne snapped, her voice shrill and echoing in the quiet office. "I'm at Valenti's and this useless card you gave me for emergencies just got flagged. It's embarrassing. The clerk is looking at me like I'm a shoplifter. Fix it. I need this ostrich skin clutch for the gala tomorrow. It's $6,000, so don't tell me about a budget." Elena looked at the documents in front of her, then back at her sister's entitled pout. "The emergency card is for medical needs or transport, Julianne. A handbag doesn't qualify." Julianne let out a theatrical groan, rolling her eyes for the benefit of her invisible vlog audience. "Oh, please. Being seen in last season's accessories at the Vance Charity Gala is a social emergency. But I forgot who I was talking to. You probably think a canvas tote from the grocery store is high fashion. Just call the bank. I'm not leaving without this bag." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Elena said, her voice dropping into a calm, melodic chill. "In fact, I'd suggest you put the bag back and go home. Things are about to get very complicated." "Ugh, you are so dramatic and bitter," Julianne hissed before cutting the call. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "She has no idea, does she?" "None," Elena whispered. "She thinks the world belongs to her because she has the right last name. She doesn't realize the name just became a liability. 3 hours later, Elena entered the foyer of the Vance estate. The sound of her modest heels on the marble floor seemed louder than usual. From the drawing room, she heard the tinkling of crystal and the practiced, melodic laughter of Victoria Vance. She walked to the doorway and paused. Victoria was seated on a velvet settee, draped in a silk caftan that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Opposite her sat Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood's most prominent gossip, her neck festooned with pearls that looked like oversized mothballs. "Ah, the working girl returns," Victoria said, not looking up from the jewelry catalog she was perusing. The scent of her heavy lily perfume hit Elena like a physical wall. Mrs. Gable was just admiring the sketches for the new wing of the hospital. "I told her we're naming it after the family, though Arthur is being uncharacteristically quiet about the funding." Mrs. Gable offered Elena a thin, pitying smile. "It must be so grounding for you, Elena, to work in compliance. Seeing how the other half struggles to follow rules. It really puts your mother's effortless grace into perspective, doesn't it?" Victoria chuckled, turning a page. "Elena has always preferred the shadows, haven't you, dear? Even as a child, she'd rather count pennies than wear diamonds. It's a shame. You'll look so dreadfully plain in the family photos tomorrow night. I've half a mind to seat you at the back with the silent auction donors." Elena walked further into the room, her hand resting on the strap of her bag where the navy folder was hidden. She looked at the towering portrait of her grandfather above the mantel, his eyes seeming to track the movement. "I think the back of the room will suit me just fine tomorrow, Mother," Elena said, her voice steady. "I've always found you get a much better view of the collapse when you're standing near the exit." Victoria paused, her pen hovering over a diamond tennis bracelet in the catalog. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as she studied Elena's face. For a fleeting second, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features, a crack in the marble mask. What a morbid thing to say. You really are getting more like your grandfather every day. He always did love a grim riddle. He loved the truth, Elena corrected softly. And he loved consequences. She turned and began to climb the stairs, leaving the two women to their tea and their delusions. She had 24 hours until the gala. 24 hours until the cards stopped working, the cars were reclaimed, and the name Vance belonged to her alone. She reached the landing and looked down at the opulent hallway. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in heartbeats. Tomorrow, the sleeping lion wouldn't just wake up. It would hunt. The morning of the Vance Foundation Gala arrived like a slow-moving storm, heavy with the scent of forced lilies and expensive aerosol. By noon, the mansion was a hive of frantic energy. Elena Vance stood on the second-floor landing, watching the chaos below. Caterers in crisp white jackets hurried across the marble foyer, their footsteps echoing like a ticking clock. She felt the weight of her phone in her pocket. A final message from Marcus Thorne had arrived minutes ago. The injunction is signed. The bank is on standby. The lion is at the gate. "Elena, move! You're blocking the light!" Julianne Vance shoved past her, nearly tripping over the hem of a shimmering gold gown that looked more like armor than silk. She held a gimbal-mounted camera in one hand, her face frozen in a practiced, wide-eyed pout for her followers. "Can you believe this?" Julianne turned the camera toward Elena, her voice shifting into a high-pitched, performative trill. "My sister is actually wearing a sweater. On gala day, some people just have zero respect for the brand." She leaned closer to the lens, whispering loud enough for the entire hallway to hear. "I guess when you don't have a seat at the table, you don't bother dressing for dinner." Elena didn't flinch. She smoothed the sleeve of her charcoal cashmere top, a piece that cost more than Julian's entire influencer kit, though its lack of a visible logo made it invisible to her sister's shallow eyes. "You might want to check your lighting, Julianne. Shadows have a way of revealing things you'd rather keep hidden." Julianne rolled her eyes and marched away, already narrating her next day in the life segment. Downstairs, Victoria Vance was in her element, presiding over the floral arrangements like a general. She wore a vintage Chanel suit, her neck draped in the Vance family emeralds. When she spotted Elena descending the stairs, Her mouth thinned into a line of pure disappointment. "There you are," Victoria said, not looking up from a tower of white roses. "I've told the event coordinator that you'll be handling the coat check overflow. It's best you stay in the foyer. The main hall will be crowded with people who actually matter." "I wouldn't worry about the main hall, Mother," Elena said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I think by the time the toast starts, everyone will be exactly where they belong." Victoria finally looked at her, a flicker of irritation crossing her perfectly made-up face. "That tone again. You've been acting like you're the one holding the gavel all week. It's exhausting, Elena. Honestly, after tonight, I think a long trip is in order, somewhere far away. I'll even pay for the one-way ticket." "I've already made my travel arrangements," Elena replied. She reached out, adjusting a single drooping rose in the centerpiece. "But you should really double-check the foundation's ledger before the guests arrive. There's a discrepancy in the endowment fund. A big one." Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh that drew the attention of Mrs. Gable, who was hovering nearby with a clipboard. "A discrepancy? Oh, Elena, you've spent too much time in compliance offices. This is the real world. We don't worry about decimals when we're the ones writing the checks." "It's not the decimals you should worry about," Elena said softly. "It's the signatures." Victoria waved her off with a manicured hand, turning back to Mrs. Gable to complain about the placement of the champagne tower. She didn't notice the way Arthur Vance, standing in the shadows of the library doorway, flinched at Elena's words. He looked at his daughter, his eyes pleading and hollow, but Elena didn't offer him a lifeline. He had chosen his side years ago. The afternoon bled into evening. The sound of silver clinking against crystal became a rhythmic pulse. Elena retreated to her room, the small, cold space they'd relegated her to years ago. She pulled a simple, midnight blue silk dress from her closet. No labels, no lace, just the kind of quality that lasted a lifetime. She checked the time. 3 hours until the first limousine pulled into the drive. She sat at her small desk and opened a leather-bound folder. Inside were the original deeds to the Vance estates, the corporate charters for the foundation, and the forensic audit Marcus had spent months perfecting. Every lie Victoria had told, every cent Julianne had squandered from accounts she didn't own, and every document Arthur had forged under pressure. It was all there, bound in black leather. Elena ran her fingers over the embossed seal of the Vance family crest. Tomorrow, the name would mean something different. Tomorrow, the quiet part of her luxury would be over. She stood up, the silk of her dress whispering against her skin. Outside, she heard the first car door slam and the high society murmur of guests arriving. "One more night," she whispered to the empty room. She turned off the light, leaving the folder on the bed. She didn't need to carry the evidence anymore. The trap was set, the guests were seated, and the woman who thought she owned the world was about to find out she was just a tenant. Elena walked toward the door, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the floor. The gala was beginning, and she had a front-row seat for the end of an empire. The evening air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, and the heavy, metallic tang of expensive car exhaust as the first wave of limousines rolled up the gravel drive. Elena Vance stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the cold mahogany banister. She wore a charcoal silk gown, tailored so perfectly it looked like liquid shadow. There were no logos, no glittering crystals, and no recognizable brand patterns. Just the unmistakable drape of high-grade mulberry silk that whispered against her skin with every breath. Down in the foyer, the sound of forced laughter and the rhythmic clinking of crystal flutes against silver trays drifted upward. It was the sound of a world that believed its foundations were made of granite, unaware they were actually standing on a crust of drying salt. Elena took a slow, steady breath, feeling the weight of the digital key in her clutch. The quiet luxury of her attire was her armor. While the others screamed for attention, she was the only one who truly understood the room. "There you are, hiding in the shadows as usual." Victoria Vance appeared at the base of the stairs, looking like a gilded statue in a gown of shimmering gold lame that caught every light in the room. She adjusted a diamond necklace that cost more than a suburban home, her eyes scanning Elena with a mixture of pity and sharp-edged disdain. Beside her, Julianne Vance held a smartphone aloft, the ring light attachment casting a clinical, artificial glow over her perfectly contoured face. "Are you actually wearing that?" Julianne asked, her voice pitched for her live stream. She turned the camera toward Elena, a smirk playing on her lips. "Look, guys, my sister decided to go for the depressed librarian aesthetic for the biggest night of the year. Maybe if we're lucky, she'll blend into the curtains and we won't have to explain her to the governor." Victoria let out a sharp, melodic laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Now, Julianne, don't be cruel. Elena has always struggled with the nuances of our social standing. It's not her fault she lacks the presence for true couture." She turned her gaze back to Elena, her voice dropping to a condescending honey. "Darling, if you're embarrassed, the catering staff could use an extra hand in the kitchen. You already look the part in that drab little number. At least then you'd be useful." The insult hung in the air, a deliberate barb intended to draw blood in front of the arriving guests. Mrs. Gable, standing nearby in a cloud of cloying tuberose perfume, let out a soft titter of agreement. "It is a bit understated for a heritage dinner, isn't it? One must respect the legacy of the name." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't flush with shame or offer a stuttered excuse. Instead, she descended the stairs with a slow, predatory grace that made Victoria's smirk falter for a fraction of a second. The sound of Elena's heels was a steady, lethal pulse against the marble. "The legacy of the name is exactly what I'm thinking about tonight, Victoria," Elena said, her voice calm and terrifyingly level. She caught the eye of Marcus Thorne, who was standing near the entrance to the ballroom. He gave her a single, imperceptible nod. The legal net was cast. The authorities were already briefed on the compliance discrepancies. "I'm sure you are," Victoria snapped, turning away to greet a local senator with a practiced, dazzling smile. "Just try not to spill any wine. I'd hate for you to ruin the only nice thing you own, even if it is department store clearance." Elena watched them move toward the ballroom, a parade of vanity and stolen prestige. She felt a hand on her arm and turned to see Arthur Vance. Her father looked older tonight, his tuxedo hanging loosely on a frame thinned by years of quiet stress. His eyes were glassy, darting toward his wife's retreating back before settling on Elena. "You shouldn't have come, Elena," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's in a mood. She's already talking about the new expansion. She's using the trust as collateral." "I know, Dad," Elena said, her voice softening only for him. She reached out and straightened his tie, her fingers brushing the silk. "But she isn't using the trust. She's using a vacuum. There's nothing left in those accounts but her own ego." "She'll destroy us all," Arthur breathed, his face pale under the amber chandeliers. "No," Elena replied, her gaze shifting to the ballroom doors where the elite of the city were gathering. "She's only destroying herself. You just need to stay clear of the blast radius." She walked past him, her silk gown rustling like a warning. The ballroom was a sea of excess. Thousands of white lilies overflowed from crystal vases, their scent almost suffocating. The string quartet played a Vivaldi concerto, the sharp violins cutting through the hum of 100 conversations. Elena moved through the crowd like a ghost in the machine. She watched Julianne cornering a young tech heir, her phone still recording every performative laugh. She watched Victoria holding court at the center of the room, sipping a vintage Krug and bragging about the Vance heritage to a circle of nodding sycophants. "The foundation of this family has always been integrity," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying over the music. "My husband's ancestors built this city, and we are merely the stewards of that greatness. It's a heavy burden, but someone must maintain the standards." Mrs. Gable sighed dramatically. "And you do it so beautifully, Victoria. I don't know how you handle the pressure, especially with the distractions." She cast a pointed look toward Elena, who was standing by the buffet, looking at a plate of hors d'oeuvres with clinical detachment. Elena felt her phone vibrate in her clutch. A text from Marcus: "All systems live. The server is primed. Just give the word." She looked up. The waitstaff were beginning to circulate, gesturing for guests to take their seats for the formal dinner and the annual heritage toast. This was the moment Victoria lived for, the public validation of her imagined throne. As the guests filed into the dining hall, Victoria caught Elena's eye from across the room. She mouthed the word "stay" at the back before sweeping toward the head table, her gold dress trailing behind her like a royal mantle. Elena didn't stay at the back. She walked toward the technical booth hidden behind the velvet drapes, her heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. She watched as Victoria took her seat, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal glass to command the room's attention. The silence that followed was absolute, filled only with the expectant breathing of the city's most powerful people. Victoria stood, her face glowing with triumphant arrogance. "Welcome, everyone, to the night the truth finally comes home." Elena reached into the booth and gripped the master override cable. "You have no idea, Victoria," she whispered to the empty air. "You have absolutely no idea." The crystal chandelier overhead hummed with a low, electric vibration that seemed to pulse in time with the sudden, expectant silence. Victoria stood at the head of the table, her hand gripping the stem of her wine glass so tightly her knuckles mirrored the stark white of the linen tablecloth. She looked out over the sea of faces, the city's elite, the gatekeepers of the prestige she craved, and smiled with the sharp, predatory grace of a woman who believed she had finally won. "For years," she began, her voice amplified by the hidden speakers, "this family has carried a burden. We have sheltered a girl who refused to honor our name, who chose the gutter over the gold we offered." She gestured vaguely toward the back of the room, her eyes seeking Elena's silhouette behind the drapes. "Tonight, the Vance family reclaims its integrity. I have the records of the missing trust funds and the proof of who has been draining our legacy." Behind the velvet curtain, Elena felt the cold, braided texture of the override cable against her palm. She didn't feel anger. She felt a strange, detached clarity. She watched through a sliver in the fabric as Mrs. Gable leaned forward, her pearls clicking against her glass, and Julianne raised her phone to capture her sister's public execution for her millions of followers. Victoria pressed a button on her remote, her chin tilted high. "Look at the screen, everyone. See the truth for yourselves." The massive projector screen at the end of the hall flickered to life, but the doctored spreadsheets Victoria had prepared didn't appear. Instead, a series of forensic accounting ledgers from the Vance Family Trust splashed across the wall in high-definition clarity. The room remained silent for a heartbeat, then a collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the air. The documents didn't show Elena's name. They showed Victoria's private offshore accounts. They showed 5 years of systematic embezzlement, totaling nearly $8 million, all funneled into Julianne's failing lifestyle brand and Victoria's offshore real estate. But the killing blow was at the bottom, the source of the trust's monthly injections. Every dollar keeping the family afloat for the last decade hadn't come from the Vance estate. It had come from a private holding company owned entirely by Elena. The transformation in Victoria was clinical. The triumphant flush that had colored her cheeks vanished, replaced by a gray, chalky pallor that made her expensive foundation look like cracked plaster. Her eyes, once sharp with malice, stretched wide until the whites showed all the way around the irises, flickering with a frantic, trapped energy. Her mouth hung open, her lower lip trembling almost imperceptibly as the muscles in her neck corded with the strain of a scream that wouldn't come. She looked less like a socialite and more like a drowning woman realizing the shore was a mirage. The glass in her hand, tilted, expensive vintage red, staining her gold dress like a fresh wound, but she didn't even seem to notice the heat of the liquid. "What is this?" Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice carrying in the stunned vacuum. She pulled her chair back, the screech of wood on marble sounding like a gunshot. "Victoria, is that your signature on the Cayman transfers?" Julianne's phone dropped to the table with a dull thud. Her influencer mask shattered, leaving her looking small and terrified as the guests began to murmur, their faces twisting from curiosity to disgust. Even Arthur, usually a ghost at his own table, stood up. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at the screen, his shoulders sagging with the weight of a secret he no longer had to carry. Marcus Thorne stepped out from the shadows near the exit, a leather briefcase tucked under his arm. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked at the head table with a lawyer's icy indifference. "The board has already seen these, Victoria. The authorities are waiting in the foyer." Elena stepped out from behind the drapes. She didn't look at the guests. She walked toward the head table, her footsteps steady and quiet. She stopped just out of reach of her mother's trembling hands. The scent of Victoria's expensive, cloying perfume was suffocating, a floral mask for the rot underneath. "You spent 20 years telling me I didn't belong in this world," Elena said, her voice a low, steady blade that cut through the frantic whispering. "You were right. I don't belong in a world built on theft and vanity." She leaned in closer, just enough so only Victoria could see the lack of pity in her eyes. "I'm not the burden, Mother. I'm the landlord, and your lease just expired." Elena turned and walked toward the grand oak doors. She didn't look back to see the security detail entering or the way the crowd parted for her like. She was the only person in the room who truly mattered. She pushed through the doors into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of the Vance legacy behind her. The silence that followed Elena's departure from the ballroom was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room until the remaining guests were left gasping. She stood on the grand stone portico, the cool night air hitting her face like a benediction. Behind her, the heavy oak doors groaned open again. "You delusional, ungrateful little wretch!" Victoria Vance's voice shrieked, shattering the quiet of the manicured gardens. She stumbled onto the terrace, her designer heels catching on the stone. Her face, usually a mask of porcelain perfection, was beginning to dissolve. The skin around her eyes puckered and sagged, the color draining until she was the shade of unbaked dough. Her mouth hung open, a jagged hole in her carefully curated image, while her throat worked in convulsive, silent swallows. The arrogant tilt of her chin had vanished, replaced by a frantic, trembling twitch that made her look every year of her age and more. She looked less like a queen, and more like a ghost, haunted by its own shadow. Julianne followed close behind, her phone still clutched in a white-knuckled grip. She wasn't filming anymore. Her eyes were wide with a primal sort of terror as she watched the other guests spill out onto the veranda, their whispers rising like a swarm of hornets. "Elena, stop this instant," Victoria demanded, though her voice lacked its usual steel. It was thin, Reedy. "You can't just say those things. The Vance estate it's mine." "Your father and My father is a silent partner in your fraud, Mother," Elena said, turning slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "And as for the estate, you're right. It was yours. Until you leveraged the family trusts to cover your lifestyle. You didn't realize who was buying up that debt, did you?" A sleek black sedan pulled into the circular driveway, the tires crunching over the expensive white gravel. Marcus Thorne stepped out, his silhouette sharp against the glowing headlights. He held a thick leather folder, his expression as impassive as a tombstone. "Good evening, Elena," he said, nodding to her before turning his gaze toward the trembling woman on the steps. "Mrs. Vance, I believe you've met my firm's representatives. They're currently at the primary residence. The locks are being changed as we speak." The sound of a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Mrs. Gable, who had spent the last hour laughing at Victoria's jokes about Elena's clearance rack life, took a visible step back. She tucked her chin, her eyes darting toward the other socialites as if checking to see which way the wind was blowing. Within seconds, the circle around the Vances widened, leaving them isolated under the harsh glow of the porch lights. "This is a mistake," Julianne stammered, her voice cracking. "Marcus, tell her." "My brand. I have a contract with the jeweler for the gala. This isn't happening." "The jewelry was part of the collateral, Julianne," the lawyer replied smoothly. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder and handed it to Victoria. "This is a formal notice of eviction and an immediate freeze on all secondary accounts. You have been living on Elena's personal dividends for 3 years. She has decided to stop the charity." Victoria Vance stared at the paper, her hands shaking so violently the document rattled. She looked up at Elena, her eyes filled with a desperate, ugly rage. You would do this, to your own blood, after everything I gave you. You gave me a front row seat to your cruelty, Elena said, stepping down the stairs until she was eye level with the woman who had spent a lifetime trying to make her feel small. She could smell the cloying scent of Victoria's perfume, now mixed with the sour tang of panic. You gave me the motivation to ensure you could never hurt anyone else the way you hurt me. You called me a burden. You called me a shadow. But shadows only exist because of the light, Mother, and I've decided to turn yours off. Arthur Vance finally appeared in the doorway, looking smaller than Elena had ever seen him. He didn't speak. He didn't defend his wife. He simply looked at the ground, the weight of 20 years of cowardice finally breaking his shoulders. Elena, please, Victoria hissed, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper as she realized the guests were watching her fall in real time. Think of the scandal. We can talk about this in private. We're family. We're a contract, Elena corrected, her voice as cold as the marble beneath them. And you've been in breach for a long time. She turned toward the car, her movements fluid and unhurried. She felt the weight of the night lift, the suffocating pressure of the Vance name finally falling away. Behind her, she heard the sound of Julianne sobbing, not for her mother, but for the loss of the life she'd stolen. She heard the sharp, judgmental murmurs of the crowd as they began to turn their backs on the fallen matriarch, already gossiping about who would take Victoria's place at the head of the social table. Marcus, Elena said as she reached the car, ensure the security detail stays at the house until the inventory is complete. I don't want a single stolen pearl leaving that property. Of course, the lawyer replied, opening the door for her. Elena paused, her hand on the cool metal of the car door. She looked back one last time. Victoria was standing alone on the steps, clutching the eviction notice to her chest like a shield that had failed. The lights of the gala behind her seemed to dim, the music muffled by the heavy silence of the night. Oh, and Mother, Elena added, her voice carrying easily through the quiet air. That dress you're wearing, it's technically company property now. I expect it returned by morning, unstained. She slid into the backseat, the door closing with a heavy, final thud. As the car pulled away, Elena didn't look back at the wreckage. She looked forward into the dark, where a new life was waiting, one she had built with her own hands, brick by legal brick. The house of Vance hadn't just fallen. She had dismantled it, and she wasn't finished with the ruins yet. 6 months had passed since the night the lights went out at the Vance estate. Elena Vance sat in her new corner office on the 42nd floor, the floor-to-ceiling glass offering a panoramic view of the city she now partially owned. The air in the room didn't smell of the heavy, cloying lilies her mother had insisted upon. Instead, it carried the crisp, clean scent of sandalwood and the faint, ozone tang of the high-end air filtration system. She smoothed the front of her charcoal wool trousers, the fabric soft and unbranded, yet woven with a precision that only the most discerning eyes would recognize as a 5-figure suit. A soft chime echoed from the door before it slid open. Marcus Thorne stepped inside, carrying a leather-bound folder that looked far more substantial than the eviction notices he had served half a year ago. He looked at her with a mix of professional respect and something akin to awe. He had watched the sleeping lion wake, and he was wise enough to stay on the right side of the glass. The final audit is complete, he said, placing the folder on the polished walnut surface of her desk. The Vance holdings have been fully restructured under your private equity firm. The name Vance has been officially scrubbed from the corporate charter. It's just EV Associates now. Elena leaned back, her chair creaking softly. And the liabilities. Marcus cleared his throat, a small, grim smile touching his lips. Victoria Vance is currently residing in a 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. It's clean, but the walls are thin enough that she's filed 3 noise complaints against the neighbors in as many weeks. Her credit remains frozen. She attempted to sell a set of silver spoons she'd hidden in her luggage during the move, but the jeweler recognized the Vance crest and called our recovery team. We reclaimed them yesterday. The image of her mother, a woman who once wouldn't step onto a private jet unless the upholstery was hand-stitched silk, Arguing with a pawn shop clerk brought a flicker of cold satisfaction to Elena's chest. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the irrelevance. In this city, Victoria was no longer a queen. She was a cautionary tale whispered over brunch by the very women who used to scramble for her favor. "And Julian?" Elena asked. "Your sister's social media accounts were permanently banned for TOS violations following the fraud investigation," Marcus replied. She tried to pivot to a lifestyle vlog from the apartment, but the lack of designer backdrops and the poor lighting her words caused her follower count to crater. "Last I heard, she was trying to secure a sponsorship for a mid-tier teeth whitening strip. It didn't go through." The door buzzed again, but this time the visitor didn't wait for an invitation. Arthur Vance shuffled into the room, looking a decade older than he had at the gala. His bespoke suit hung loosely on a frame that had lost its posture, and his eyes were clouded with a weary, lingering shame. He stopped a few feet from the desk, clutching a tattered hat in his hands. "Elena," he rasped. She didn't stand. She didn't offer him a seat. She simply watched him, the silence in the room stretching until it felt like a physical weight. "Father, your mother, she's asking for an increase in the monthly stipend," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. "She says the heating in the building is inconsistent. She says it's beneath her dignity to live like this." "Dignity is earned, not inherited," Elena said, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. "The stipend is calculated based on the cost of living for a standard citizen. If she finds it insufficient, she is more than welcome to seek employment. I believe Mrs. Gable is looking for a new personal assistant, though given their history, I doubt the interview would go well." Arthur flinched. He looked around the sleek, powerful office, a room he had once dreamed of occupying but never had the courage to take. "You really did it. You tore it all down." "I didn't tear it down, Father. I just stopped holding up the ceiling while you all danced in the ballroom," she replied. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a small, velvet box. She opened it to reveal the single, perfect pearl necklace Victoria had tried to steal on her way out. Elena let the gems slide through her fingers, the clicking sound sharp in the quiet room. "I'm keeping these. Not because they're valuable, but because they're a reminder of what happens when you mistake a lion for a rug." Arthur nodded slowly, realizing there was no mercy left to squeeze from the stone. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped. As the door closed behind him, the silence returned, heavier than before. Elena looked out at the city, the lights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over the skyline. She had won. The company was hers, the fortune was secured, and the people who had spent 20 years crushing her spirit were finally feeling the weight of their own choices. But as she sat in the center of her empire, she felt the coldness of the glass against her fingertips. She had dismantled her family to build her kingdom, and while the foundation was solid, the halls were very, very quiet. She picked up her pen, the silver cool and heavy in her hand, and turned back to the ledger. The price of justice had been high, but as she signed the first check for her new charitable foundation, Elena knew she would pay it all over again. The Vance name was dead, and for the first time in her life, she could finally breathe.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.